Today we're going to pick up with our History of Canada in 10 lessons, and we're going to talk about what was happening on the West Coast at about the time before Confederation. So before Canada was Canada, what was happening on the West Coast. Now, before we start, we are going to be looking at a review. So after the blank blank, the United States of America became independent. That meant it was no longer controlled by Great Britain. So what was the thing called where the United States kind of fought a war against Britain and they became independent? And the place you can find that information, if you don't have it already, is in your Lesson 4 notes. So your Lesson 4 notes. So I invite you to pause the video and see if you can figure out what was the war called where the United States fought off, well, they used to be British colonies in what's now the United States, the 13 British colonies, but they fought off the British and they became independent. It was called the American Revolution. So after the American Revolution, the United States of America became independent. And as you'll remember, the part of North America that's now Canada, so Nova Scotia, the province of Quebec, all these places, they didn't fight against the United States. They stayed loyal. And many people they didn't fight against Great Britain. They stayed loyal. And many of the people who live in what used to be the British colonies, but then had become the independent United States, came up to Canada as loyalists. And if you look at this map, you can see this is what the North America looks like at this point. You've got the British colonies up here. You have Spanish possessions down here further south in like Mexico and the western part of the world, of the continent. And then you have the United States, this new kind of independent country. And over here, this is the area we're going to be talking about today. So we're talking about basically what was happening on the West Coast. So this is what you'll fill in your notes. Now, in this slide, we see a map of the world. And the questions are twofold. So first, I want you to observe, what do you notice about how far away the west coast of North America is from Europe? So this is the west coast of North America, right here, what I'm showing you with my cursor. And if you're paying attention, you'll notice this whole area that I've just covered in red, like it is very far away from Europe, right? Like if I want to get from England to what's now Nova Scotia, I go like that. But if I want to get from England to get all the way to what's now British Columbia, I have to go like, and then it takes me a lot longer. I mean, the other way I guess I could get there is I go, and then I'd come out the other side of the Pacific and I could end up here. But either way, to get there, it takes a lot longer. So that meant that European exploration of what's now kind of the west coast of North America took a lot longer to happen before Europeans arrived here. So Europeans were arriving in this part of the world in the 1500s, right? You can think of Jacques Cartier and Samuel de Champlain and John Cabot. There were not really Europeans arriving up here until the very late 1700s and early 1800s. So indigenous people stayed here a lot earlier without having contact with Europeans. So we'll go on now to talking about, so here we can fill in these blanks. Europeans were exploring and settling all over the eastern part of North America, but the west coast of the continent was too far away for much early settlement. That means that Pacific Coast indigenous peoples did not make contact with European explorers and traders for centuries later than indigenous peoples on the Atlantic coast. And what were those indigenous people doing? Well, I just want to show you this image here and kind of ask you to pause and take a look at what is going on in this image. So you can see that they've got these rich buildings back here, and they lived and the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Coast, of this part of the Pacific Coast, which currently coastal BC, would have lived in these big cedar kind of homes, not just one small family, but an entire big family group. That they had these elaborate coats and elaborate hats, and that they were quite wealthy, and there were lots of them. So I'm going to read this description of what the artist was trying to show in this image. The artist's rendition of the village scene illustrates many of the major characteristics of late West Coast culture. Large multi-family plank houses form a row facing the sea, with shell middens being present behind and between houses. A successful raiding party has returned with prisoners as slaves, the heads of slain enemies retained as war trophies, and loot in the form of material goods. The leader of the war party is greeted by the village leaders who are in ceremonial garb, in ceremonial dress. In the middle background, an old woman is dressed in a woolen, woven cedar bark tunic, cape, and hat. She watches the proceedings while the far background, two dugout canoes have bark mats thrown over them to prevent the canoes from drying out in the sun and cracking. The man in the left-hand corner wears a woven spruce rat potlatch hat with 3 rings on top, indicated that the individual has validated his rights and privileges in 3 potlatch ceremonies. So there's a lot going on in that description. It's a very high-level description. But the key point is that this is a very wealthy society with lots of people in it because of the bounty of the ocean, right? We've talked before about how the salmon harvest and just kind of the climate of what's currently BC really meant that this was one of the richest parts for Indigenous peoples before Europeans arrived. And that meant they had very complex societies with clear chiefs, and they had large battles and wars, and they would capture each other and bring people into slavery, and they would have this giant kind of civilization, right? A civilization that was just kind of as strong and important as any of the ones that were in Europe. However, we've talked before about how even before the Europeans arrived in various places, they would notice that it seemed like there were fewer people there than they expected. And this is because there had been so many epidemics of smallpox and other infectious diseases that had ripped through these native communities even before they met Europeans. Because what would happen is one European community would infect one Indigenous community, but that Indigenous community would then trade all the way up, and so infection would pass through. So I'm going to read this description of what was happening in British Columbia before even the Europeans arrived. Everywhere they looked, so this is the first European sailors who eventually came. Everywhere they looked, there were corpses. Abandoned, overgrown villages were littered with skulls. Whole sections of the coastline strewn with bleached, decayed bodies. The skulls, limbs, ribs, and backbones, or some other vestiges of the human body, were found in many places, promiscuously scattered about the beach in great numbers, wrote explorer George Vancouver in what is now Port Discovery, Washington. It was May 1792. The lush environs, the lush area of the Georgia Strait, had once been among the most densely populated corners of the land that is now Canada, with humming villages, harbors swarming with canoes, and valleys so packed with cook fires that they had smog. But the Vancouver expedition experienced only eerie quiet. They kept seeing rotting houses and massive clearings cut out of the Pacific forest, evidence that whoever lived here had been able to muster armies of laborers. And yet the only locals that the sailors encountered were small groups of desperately poor people, many of them horribly scarred and missing an eye. So what you can gather from that is that this had been an extremely rich culture and civilization. But when the Europeans arrived, they found that it had already been devastated by disease and war and all this kind of thing, even before the Europeans had arrived. And many of the people that they met were in a position where their communities had already been really hurt. So the beginning of BC starts off, in many ways, as a tragedy. However, smallpox had already spread from the eastern part of the continent, killing thousands of people and weakening the indigenous nations of the West Coast. So there was a member of the Kwantlen First Nation, and she described smallpox to somebody much later on, and this is the description she gave. Where his breath touched them, sores broke out, and they burned with heat, and they died to feed this monster, she said. And so the village was deserted, and never again would the Indians live on that spot. And so she's comparing smallpox disease to a dragon that is ripping through these communities and reducing the population big time. So again, the beginning of BC and the beginning of kind of European settlement in this part of the province or this part of the country starts off with a bit of a tragedy. At about the same time that all this is happening, back in Europe, ships were getting better and better, and different countries competed to explore the furthest reaches of the world. The ship on the left, it was the HMS Resolution, and HMS stands for His Majesty's Ship, or Her Majesty's Ship, and that means that it belongs to the King or the Queen of England. And this ship was British Captain James Cook's ship on his final voyage around the world, when he first visited what is now British Columbia. Now, notice here how it says she. For whatever reason, in maritime and in maritime law and in kind of talking about ships, we always give them a female adjective or pronouns. So we always say a ship is we always give them female pronouns, and it probably has to do with the fact that most sailors back in the day would have been men. And so, they spent all their time with a ship, and so they started calling her a her. And this is just kind of an image of what that ship would have looked like. And then here is a map of this gentleman, James Cook, and his voyages. And he was, as you can see, British. He's leaving from Britain. You can see that he goes all over the world doing all sorts of explorations. And if we were in Australia, we would also be talking about James Cook because he spent some time in Australia. As you can see, he had also spent a bunch of time here in New Zealand in the southern part of the Pacific. And he was exploring for Britain and kind of looking around all these different places. Spanish explorers are believed to have traveled in this region in the 1700s, coming north from the Spanish colonies in California. But James Cook was one of the first British explorers to reach what is now British Columbia. He discovered what is now Victoria in 1778. And as you can see, I put discovered in those quotation marks to kind of indicate that, discovered in that context doesn't really fit, right? Because there were already people living here, but he was one of the first Europeans to land there. Another major British explorer was George Vancouver, who mapped out the west coast of what is now British Columbia between 1791 and 1795. So if you look over here, this is an image of, or a statue of George Vancouver, and you can wonder, where is this located? And I think, there's a few kids in the class who live in my neighborhood. This is not far from where I live. And this is a statue of George Vancouver located in front of Vancouver City Hall. So, he is the person after whom our city is named because he was one of the first British explorers that came through. And this is a period where many explorers from different countries are kind of coming through the Pacific coast. I'm going to show you an image in a minute of the British Columbia Legislature building, and that's the headquarters of the government in BC. I just want to show you kind of something about it. So we're going to go and take a look at this image. So this here is the image of the British Columbia Legislative Building. And if you look at it, it's in Victoria, and this is kind of where all the politicians meet, and the premier meets, and kind of all the decisions are made for how the province is governed. But if you look at it and you kind of zoom in, right up top on the roof, you can see this image of this man in gold. And this is an image of Sir James Cook, and Captain James Cook. And he was the first kind of British explorer to come through here. And later on, when British settlers kind of were founding British Columbia as a British colony, they obviously wanted to kind of put up a statue of someone that they thought was an important British guy. So they put him on top of the legislature. So now we'll go back and we'll talk a bit more about another kind of source of British influence here. So there was some coming from the ocean, but another group of people coming in this direction were the fur traders. And the most important companies in the fur trade were the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company. And fur traders, they established these forts and factories, and these are basically places where they would meet with indigenous people and they would trade for, the indigenous people would give them fur, the Europeans would give them manufactured goods like pots and pans and all that sort of thing. So they established forts and factories all across the rivers of the western part of Canada. And these were the places indigenous peoples could come to trade. And then the fur traders would send their furs that they had traded back to Hudson's Bay or to Montreal in order to be sent back to Europe. And just a kind of a short video to give you a sense of this from Hudson's Bay Company. So the bay, like where some of your parents probably go shopping, the bay is the successor to the Hudson's Bay Company, the company that was doing all this fur trading back in the day. And they kind of have an image of they have a little video about how they were part of the creation of the western part of Canada in particular.
When people think of Canada, they often assume that the maple leaf is our official emblem. While the maple leaf is displayed proudly on Canada's flag, you might be surprised to find that our emblem is actually the beaver. You might think of the beaver as Canada's largest rodent or nature's engineer, but actually, it was one of the main reasons for European exploration into the northern and western regions that would eventually form a large part of Canada, and all because of fashion. In the 17th century, everyone in Europe wanted a beaver on their head. To wear as a hat, that is. After the long hairs were removed from the beaver pelt, the shorter hairs close to the skin were used to produce a soft felt that was durable, waterproof, and could be fashioned into hats of various shapes. The beaver population in Europe was almost extinct, but the hats were in such high demand that new sources of pelts were needed. Canada provided an excellent source. The French already had established a fur trade along the southern waterways. In 1670, a group of adventurers petitioned the King of England to grant them monopoly over the fur trade in Canada's north. The royal charter issued by Charles II created Rupert's Land, defined as all the land drained by rivers flowing into Hudson's Bay. It also established the Hudson's Bay Company, which played a significant role in the development of Canada. The Hudson's Bay Company quickly established outposts and developed a mutually beneficial trade with the Aboriginal people. Aboriginal traders supplied the beaver pelts, and in exchange, the European traders provided useful and valuable manufactured goods that were not otherwise available. The First Nations were skilled traders. It was common practice for them to shop around for the best deals between individual Hudson's Bay Company trading posts. This led to the company developing the Standard of Trade, a price document used by all trading posts. In the 19th century, a type of currency was developed, a made beaver token. The tokens represented the estimated value of a prime beaver pelt ready for trade. They were given out to represent credit that a trader had with the company. All trade goods had their value expressed in relation to the made beaver. Aboriginal traders received goods they needed in exchange for their beaver pelts. If they did not spend the full value of the pelts they brought, they received made beaver tokens for the difference that could be exchanged for goods at a later time. Over time, the company moved inland to find new sources of supply and broaden its reach. As it did so, HBC established more outposts to conduct the trading. Where beaver were not abundant, the company's trade was built on whatever animal was locally valuable. On the Pacific coast, this was the salmon, and in the far north, it was the Arctic fox. After 1870, European immigrants began to settle the West, part of the former Rupert's Land. This expansion into new lands contributed to the formation of Canada. The trade in beaver pelts for making hats continued until the 1850s, when silk hats became a more popular choice. Queen Victoria's husband, Prince Albert, led this change in fashion. Beaver pelts were also valued for their use in manufacturing fur coats. Pelts continued to be traded by HBC in the fur business until 1987. By 1929, Canada's beaver population had been reduced to such an extent that it was nearing extinction in some areas. This prompted Jimmy Watt, the manager at Rupert House, and his wife Maud to establish the first beaver preserve in 1930. By 1944, HBC beaver sanctuaries covered 110,000 square kilometers. Today, the Canadian beaver is thriving, just like the country that it represents.
So as you can see, there has been, all these kind of fur trading forts all throughout the western part of the country kind of played a really important role in making Canada what it is today. And that's also true in BC. So there were a bunch of different fur trading locations in what is now the southern part of British Columbia. And I'll kind of label a few of them with you, and I ask you to do the same on your sheet. So the first one that I'm going to label is Fort Langley. So Fort Langley is kind of where Langley is today. And so it's just a little bit east of Vancouver. So there's Fort Langley. And I'm just going to put a little circle for it, but I didn't ask you on yours to put a circle and then label it Fort Langley. And then down here where Fort Victoria is, that is another Hudson's Bay Company fort that kind of was at the beginning of the province. There's Vancouver. Now Vancouver was considerably later that it kind of became a big deal, certainly after Fort Langley. Yale is up kind of around here. I hope I'm getting this right. Hope is another one. It was a little bit further east even of Fort Langley. And then up here, there is Kamloops, kind of where the rivers cross. So you've got all these different forts, and these are the major places where Indigenous people would meet up with Europeans to trade for furs in what is now BC. And you can see that they're the kind of the beginnings of the cities that we have here in British Columbia today. So there was James Cook coming from the ocean, but then there were also people, and George Vancouver coming from the ocean as well. There were also fur traders who crossed the Rocky Mountains, and they came all the way from Montreal, they came all the way from Eastern Canada, and they crossed the Rocky Mountains and they canoed down to the Pacific, because they were trying to see, is there a way that we can somehow get to the Pacific easily by boat? And, you know, truth be told, there isn't, because there's those giant Rocky Mountains in between. But these guys definitely tried it. And so you've got Alexander Mackenzie and Simon Fraser, and they were two early fur traders who crossed the Rocky Mountains and canoed to the Pacific. And as you can imagine, they named a lot after them. So there's a giant river in Canada called the Mackenzie River, which goes up to the Arctic River. And then there's also Simon Fraser University and the Fraser River, because these were two kind of early explorers coming from the east. So here's Simon Fraser as he works his way down the Fraser River. And then here's an image of Alexander Mackenzie. And this he carved into the rock. It says, Alex Mackenzie from Canada by land, 22nd July, 1793. And so this rock is right near where Bella Coola is today in British Columbia. And it is where he just carved this into the rock to represent we had finally made it to the Pacific from Canada. So in any case, the Hudson's Bay Company created several major forts in what is now British Columbia. Two really important ones are Fort Victoria and Fort Langley. These grew into the colonies of Vancouver Island and New Caledonia, although I'll tell you, New Caledonia changed its name pretty soon to British Columbia. And then later on, the British government just kind of put the colony of Vancouver Island and the colony of British Columbia together. So they grew into the colonies of Vancouver Island and New Caledonia, better known as British Columbia. Now, an important thing happened in 1858, because previously they had just been trading, you know, for furs with the native people. There were really not that many Europeans up there. But in 1858, gold was discovered in the Fraser River area. And this caused the first gold rush, which was when tens of thousands of prospectors came north from the United States. And many of these people were of Chinese heritage. So there had been previous gold rushes where people had come over from China to San Francisco and California. And many of those people also came up north to what is now BC in order to try and find some gold. And, you know, if you found gold, you get rich. Most of these guys, unfortunately, did not find very much gold, but they stayed, many of them stayed, and many of them became kind of the founders of what is now British Columbia. And so the earliest kind of Chinese Canadians started off at that point. And of course, there were also thousands and thousands of British people, thousands and thousands of Americans who, you know, today are part of kind of the founders of the province. So here's a short video on that.
British Columbia was very different 150 years ago. For many centuries, it was solely the domain of the First Nations. In the late 1700s, European fur traders began to arrive.
Then one day in 1856, a native man was taking a drink from the Thompson River when he noticed a glittering pebble. And with that, the history of British Columbia was changed forever. The pebble, of course, was gold. The First Nations people quickly learned how the Europeans treasured this shiny metal.
Soon, the entire band was collecting bits of it to trade at Fort Kamloops. James Douglas, head of the Hudson's Bay Company in the district and also governor of Vancouver Island, at first provided them with spoons to help pry the gold out of the rocky crevices. Later, the company supplied picks, shovels, and gold pans. The First Nations were angry when American miners appeared on the scene and tried to push them aside.
By 1857, Douglas feared there would be war between the Americans and the First Nations along the Fraser and Thompson rivers.
In the spring of 1858, 1,000 ounces of gold was sent to be processed at the San Francisco Mint. Soon, word leaked out where it had come from, and the rush to the Fraser River was on. About 20,000 miners headed north that year.
Fearful that Americans would start taking over the territory, Douglas extended his authority to the mainland, which was not yet a colony. Soon, however, the British government established the mainland colony of British Columbia and named James Douglas its governor as well.
The Fraser River Gold Rush was only the first of several gold rushes into nearby regions, but it was the catalyst in 1858 in creating what we now call British Columbia.
So there you saw kind of the key role played by this gentleman, Sir James Douglas. And he's the person after whom the Douglas fir has been named. And he kind of was instrumental in kind of governing the colony in its early days because he was kind of that governor. So his job was he was appointed by the British government to kind of make decisions for how Victoria should operate. And he also, he kind of had two jobs, right? So one was he was working for the British government. The other one, he was working for the Hudson's Bay Company. And he was trading with indigenous people for, the European manufactured goods and the furs that the indigenous people would have had. And so he, during the middle of this gold rush, he kind of imposed order. He said, we need to have law and order so that all these crazy Americans coming up cannot kind of overrule and run over the province. And he, helped to maintain peace in that way. And kind of an interesting tidbit about him is that he was, in the middle of the 1800s, he was half black because his mother was, I'm not sure which Caribbean country, but his mother was kind of of Caribbean ancestry, and his father was Scottish. So the first governor of British Columbia was, basically a mixed half black person, which you don't necessarily think of, from that long ago, when many Europeans were quite, stereotyping and racist towards people who were not white. But I guess my point, the reason that I raise that is just to kind of make the point that even from the beginnings, there has always been something interesting about Canada and about kind of the community that we're part of, that there was that there was a land of opportunity for people who were different. Another gentleman who was kind of different was this gentleman named Judge Matthew Begbie, and he was responsible for being the judge and kind of dispensing law and order in the middle of the gold rush. So I'm going to watch we're going to show two last videos about these two guys, and that will be the end of our lesson. So here's one about James Douglas.
The colony of British Columbia was created in 1858 in response to a gold rush swarming up the Fraser River. It was obvious that this new and far-off colony could only survive with a strong leader. For its first governor, Britain appointed a man who had already proven his worth as governor of Vancouver Island. His name was James Douglas. Then in his 50s, James Douglas had come a long way, from humble origins in Guyana, South America. His father was a Scottish sugar planter, and his mother a free-colored woman from Barbados. Young James received his first formal training in Scotland at age 9. 6 years later, he apprenticed to the fur trade in North America, where he rose quickly up through the ranks. In 1849, Douglas became chief factor at Fort Victoria, with responsibility for all the Hudson's Bay Company's operations west of the Rocky Mountains. After the colony of Vancouver Island was created, Douglas became its second governor. In 1858, when the Fraser River Gold Rush began, Douglas wisely extended his authority to the still uncolonized mainland to preserve law and order. The British government appreciated Douglas's prompt action, and when it created the new mainland colony of British Columbia, Douglas was appointed governor. A steady drizzle fell on the new capital of Fort Langley in November 1858, as Douglas arrived on the steamship Beaver to be sworn in. James Douglas remained governor of British Columbia and Vancouver Island until his retirement in 1864. He was knighted by Queen Victoria for his loyal service, and revered by the citizens who prospered under his rule. Thanks to James Douglas, British Columbia had a strong beginning.
And so that was James Douglas, and now we'll talk about Matthew Begbie.
150 years ago, European settlement in what is now British Columbia consisted of only a few remote fur trading posts and one small British colony on Vancouver Island.
When the Fraser River Gold Rush erupted in 1858, The new mainland colony desperately needed someone to maintain order there.
The person who did this was a tall man and a towering figure, Matthew Bailey Begbie. Born in 1819, Begbie was raised in the Channel Islands and educated at Cambridge University. He was a lawyer in London when, at age 39, he was recommended for the position of Chief Justice of the new Pacific colony. Begbie was well suited for the job, not only because of his training, but also his physical strength and stamina. He was the ideal man for a new country. In his early career, Begbie crisscrossed British Columbia on an annual circuit, traveling on horseback, by steamship and canoe, and on foot.
He held court wherever he could, in saloons or outdoors, where he heard cases sitting on a log or high in the saddle.
Wherever he presided, Begbie always wore a black robe and wig, the symbols of his office, in order to maintain the authority and dignity of the court. He was well known and respected in the toughest regions of the colony for his wit as well as his fairness. Begbie could be very firm, maintaining law and order in the goldfields, but he also showed compassion.
After his death, people started calling him the hanging judge, but historians don't really know why. His decisions were never arbitrary or overly harsh for the times.
Knighted in 1875, Sir Matthew spent his later career in this courtroom, now part of BC's Maritime Museum in Victoria. People say his spirit can still be felt in the old courthouse, and his sense of justice in all of British Columbia.
So that's the end of our discussion of kind of early British Columbia before it became part of Canada. Next lesson that we'll do is we're going to be talking about Confederation, what happened kind of after the American Revolution with the British colonies, and then how Canada started to become its own country as we prepared to, protect ourselves from the American threat. And so that's what we'll talk about next week. Thank you for listening.